I went camping in the desert and met something terrible. A few nights ago, I went camping with my cousin Theo and our friend Leilani. The three of us are all travel bloggers or journalists. I freelance, Theo and Leilani work for the same magazine. And a lot of what we do is just going to various locations together, then writing about whatever aspect of it our readers are interested in. Theo does all nature stuff, hiking, camping, survivalist stuff. Remind me to tell you about our trip through Appalachia last year. Yikes. Anyway, Theo wanted to branch out of the mountains and try an excursion in the desert near Navajo territory. We found a remote camping spot, set up tents, and started a campfire. Leilani has been reading a lot about protective rituals. We run into a lot of weird stuff, what can I say, and felt really confident about some advice she got. So as we set up camp, she burned some white sage and Palo Santo in the fire, then mixed the ashes with salt and spread it out in a rough circle around our campsite. The three of us laughed about it as she did, not really believing it would do much, except Leilani, but willing to waste the time if nothing else. It was well after dark when I offered to run back to the car to grab the food we had brought for dinner. The car was parked a ways off from our campsite, and I left Theo and Leilani chatting and laughing by the fire, feeling comfortable in the warm desert night. Just as I locked the car and started making my way back to the fire, I heard Theo shouting my name from somewhere off in the desert. I yelled back, asking what he wanted, and heard him respond, this time his voice coming from the direction of our campfire. "Don't say anything else. Get back to the fire as fast as you can." From behind me, closer to the car, I heard Leilani's voice calling softly for me to come back. I felt cold dripping down my spine and broke into a run. I got to the fire just in time to hear my own voice calling out for Theo and Leilani to join me in the desert on the opposite side of the fire. I yelled out that it wasn't me, and for them to stay where they were, and jumped across the threshold of salt and ash. Just as I did, I heard my own name being called again. I'm still cold thinking about it. My own name being said in my own voice, followed by deep, throaty laughter. Theo, Leilani, and I stared at each other in horror and huddled closer to the fire as Theo threw more sage onto the fire, scooping white ash onto his wood chopping axe. The voice hissed derisively from the darkness as a pale face came into view. It was clearly human, but looked all wrong. The face was stretched and thin in all the wrong places, while wrinkled and leathery, as if it had been stretched out and pressed back into place over and over. The body was covered in different animal furs and skins, as well as more than one variety of leather, most of which looked disturbingly human. The creature smiled and crouched a few feet away from the ring of ash. It grabbed a stick and leaned forward, an amused look in its eyes, as if about to tell a joke, then pushed the ash with the stick and said, "Oh no, your border is broken, friends." Its voice was amused and light, as though simply making a joke amongst friends. I looked at Theo and Leilani, who were both as deadly pale as I felt. Theo stepped forward and brandished the ash-covered axe. The creature grimaced and dropped the stick, putting its hands up in surrender and sitting back on its haunches. I grabbed more ash and salt and redrew the boundary line. The four of us stood there in a silent standoff. Theo, Leilani, and I silent and horrified, while the creature sat cross-legged and smiled as if it was spending a relaxing night with friends. It gestured to the cooler bag full of food and said, "Aren't you going to eat? Please, don't allow me to impose." I looked back at Theo and Leilani again and cleared my throat. "What are you?" The creature laughed and spoke back first in what I assume must be its own voice, changing slowly between its voice, my own voice, Theo's, and Leilani's as it talked. "Oh, child, I am older than the trees growing around your camp. Older than the sage in your fire, I am sharper than the blade of your axe, and stronger than the ironwood trees you burn in your fire. I am only one of my kind, but I was one of the first and expect I will be one of the last." Leilani took the bag from my hands and opened it, moving purposefully, as if the creature wasn't watching us intently, and began pulling out food to heat over the fire. Theo leaned down and handed me my sketchbook, nodding for me to sit by the fire with a silent message. "Draw while you can, and keep the sage at hand." I sat down, trying not to shake as I slowly began to sketch, while Theo knelt across from the thing, axe still clutched firmly in hand. It leaned forward, letting the firelight dance across its face and glow in its eyes, but maintaining a respectful distance from our boundary lines. It's been a long time since my portrait was taken. What a lovely group for me to find myself in company with. Leilani glanced over, looking at the thing as if it were simply an unwelcome guest overstaying his welcome, and gestured at it absently with a kebab. "What do you want?" The creature smiled again, reminding me jarringly of my grandfather. Not that my grandfather was a nightmarish voice-stealing creature, but something about it seemed almost paternal, as if he really was just chilling by the fire with his grandkids. Not your food if that's what you're asking me. I find far better nourishment in other ways. I looked up from my sketch, trying to keep a casual expression, and looked at Theo and Leilani out of the corner of my eyes to see their stony expressions. None of us asked for clarification, and the creature offered none, instead watching the three of us silently. As Leilani finished cooking, it sighed and stood up like it was stretching and walked slow circles around our campsite. Pay no mind to me. I had no intention of ruining your night. I merely liked to listen. We sat in silence for a while, then slowly resumed a stilted conversation, trying to pretend that nothing was wrong, discussing the day, our plans for the next leg of our journey, and finally choosing to talk about the scenery. Occasionally, one of our voices would chime in from the darkness with a comment or a suggestion that we all go for a walk, and we would sit in silence as the ancient being would chuckle at its own jokes. We spent the entire night that way, the three of us awake and on edge, a shifting voice in the darkness beyond our campsite beckoning for us to join it. Late in the night, it rejoined the firelight with a friendly smile that made my blood run cold. It said, "Don't young people like to tell stories anymore? Whatever happened to the old legends of the stars and gods?" Theo, his specialty being storytelling, perked up at this, but a warning hand on his arm from Leilani kept him silent. I spoke up instead. "I'm sure you have stories of your own, don't you? You must know more about the old legends than any of us." It smiled, like I had said something wonderful, and gestured to the three of us. "How about this? Each of you tells a story, a legend of any kind. If you entertain me, I'll tell my own story, then I'll leave you in the morning, but on the sole condition that you never return here again. These are my lands, and while the company has been pleasant this evening, I rarely find myself in such a generous mood." We stared at each other, and finally, Leilani spoke. "You just want to hear campfire stories? That's all we have to do for you to guarantee we leave here alive?" The creature nodded, skin pulling back from its face in a wide smile, and waited. The three of us silently agreed, and Theo nodded for me to take the lead. I looked down at the sketchbook in my hand and smiled. "Would you like to hear an illustrated story?" The creature looked hungrily at my sketchbook, and I opened it with a shiver, going through the pages one by one and telling the stories of the things we've encountered. Theo and Leilani chimed in occasionally, and we relaxed into the stories, as though simply recounting our adventures to a curious stranger. I found myself enjoying the stories more than I had expected. While he was terrifying, the creature was also a surprisingly good listener. He would nod and laugh, ask questions with genuine curiosity, and sat back with a smile when I closed the book. "Oh yes, I chose the right fire tonight." It turned expectant eyes on Theo and Leilani, and Theo leaped into his favorite legend about the marriage of the Norse goddess Freya. He had always loved the Nordic legends since we were kids, and he told it the same way he had told me stories as children. Every character had a voice of their own, which seemed to delight the creature to no end, and he waved his hands in the air with animated excitement. The creature listened intently, chuckling occasionally, and repeating sentences back in Theo's voice when it found them particularly amusing. It especially seemed to enjoy mimicking the strange voices Theo would do for each character. I felt a shiver watching them interact. In another world, I could imagine this being one of Theo's friends. It was hard to see the thing in front of us as anything other than a monster, but the storytelling seemed to be bringing out its human side. Theo wrapped up the story with a satisfied smile, and the creature turned to Leilani, who looked at us with a smile that made my bones feel brittle with anxiety. She had something planned, and I had the sinking feeling I wasn't going to like it at all. She began, "It was a dark night, darker than this one, and a young man was walking home late on a deserted road. His route took him past a cemetery, and as he walked past the gates, he got the creeping feeling he was being followed. After a few steps, he heard a bump from behind him. Too afraid to look, he walked faster, but the noise continued getting louder. Bump, scrape, bump, scrape, on and on. Closing the distance, he finally turned around to see a coffin barely illuminated by a streetlight standing on end, bumping down the street after him. He started running for his life, but the coffin only followed faster. Bump, scrape, bump, scrape. Finally, he got to his home and ran to his tool shed where he had an axe. He threw it at the coffin, but that did nothing to stop it. He ran into the house, and the coffin followed him up the porch, breaking down the front door after him. He ran up the stairs and grabbed his shotgun, firing at the coffin as it came through the doorway, but the now splintered coffin only continued to approach. In desperation, he ran into his bathroom and began to hurl items at the coffin. The last item he threw was a bottle of cough syrup. It shattered against the coffin, drenching it in cough syrup. The coffin stopped. I looked over at Theo with horror and saw him watching Leilani with absolute pride and adoration. Of course, in a life or death situation, she would tell a pun. The creature had its head slightly bent, repeating the last part of Leilani's story in her voice, then its own. After a moment, it looked up with a completely serious expression. Cough syrup. Stop the coughing. Leilani nodded, smiling broadly. The creature burst into laughter, a sound of such pure mirth that for a moment I felt like I could truly see the human face that had once been there. The creature leaned back, still grinning, and looked at each of us in turn. I suppose you have fulfilled your end of the deal. I shall fulfill mine. Theo added another bundle of sticks to the fire, and Leilani put on a pot of water to boil, nodding for me to grab tea and our cups out of the pack. The creature watched patiently, then nodded to the tea. Before I begin, may I expect the hospitality could be extended to me? We looked at each other, surprised. Then Leilani shrugged, and I handed her a fourth cup. When the tea was ready, I stood up and placed the cup outside the circle of ash. The creature tapped it gently with a long, bony finger and sighed. My story begins long before any of the stories you three have told tonight. It begins when animals roam the earth that have not existed for many seasons. I was a young man, a hunter, and a skilled one. But try as I might, I could do nothing to elevate my status among my people. No matter the kills I brought home, or the danger I stopped, it seemed that my position remained one of absolute mediocrity. There was little room for me to grow among my own people, so I left home, promising to return when I had achieved greatness, and only then. My goal was always to return to a place of high standing, my rightful place. He paused to sip his tea, his face cold and a faraway look in his eyes. His face began to morph slightly. No longer the deadly face of an inhuman creature, he had the handsome but haughty face of a young man. He had dark hair, high strong cheekbones, a slim but strong jaw, and a large bony nose. The features were like shadows though, shifting and indistinct. The jaw would be square one moment, slightly rounder the next. The nose seemed to change size and shape constantly. The only thing that remained steady were the sharp, high cheekbones and deep-set eyes. I realized that what I was seeing was his clearest memory of what he had looked like as a young man. The face no longer belonged to him though, and he was unable to hold it in place for very long. His face morphed back into whatever it was he had become. I left. I traveled for a long time and had many adventures much like the three of you, but none of it was enough. Until one day I found a man, living alone amongst the desecrated remains of a large village. His face shifted again, this time to an older man. Ugly scars and lines cut deep through his face, and there was a coldness to his dark leathery skin that made me feel sick. Where the younger man had been haughty, with the eyes of a warrior, this man was shifty, vengeful, and weak in the kind of way that turns people evil. This face too looked wrong on the creature though. The qualities seemed indistinct, reminding me of Halloween masks. The details were clear enough, but there was nothing human behind those eyes. Clearly something had happened, and I told him I would avenge whatever tragedy had befallen his land. But before I could finish speaking, he took the pelt from his back and brought it over his face, transforming into an animal you would no longer have a name for. He leaped at me, and I fought as best as I could. Finally, after a long fight, we separated, both too exhausted to continue, and I begged him to teach me what he had just done. He agreed, and I spent many years under his tutelage. He stopped, looking at us for a long time. You have no desire to know what all that entailed, and I swore to myself I would teach no one. But I perfected the art forms he taught me. I completed the rituals and became even stronger than him. In the process, I discovered what had befallen his people. He killed them, every man, woman, and child. He killed them, skinned the strongest of them, and ate them. I felt a pit forming in my stomach. He spoke the words as though he was simply describing the night sky, factual, emotionless. He continued, "When I discovered this truth, I knew what I had to do. When I had become strong enough, I killed him and made his skin one of my first pelts." He absent-mindedly touched one of the leathery skins on his back. I ate of his flesh and began my journey back to my home as a hero. At first, that was how I was greeted. But all powers must be fed, and this power I had obtained demanded a very specific type of nourishment. After a time, I killed the leader of my people and ate of his flesh as well. At first, I merely took his form, but I was soon found out. His children knew I was not in my true form, so I ate them as well. Children can often see beyond the veil. The warning cry of a child is not to be ignored. As the years passed, my true form began to change. I could no longer wear my own face, lest the people who knew me see what I had become. The face he had once called his own hovered for a moment before melting back into the monster. True power frightens many, and most are not equipped to see it. Slowly, the years passed, and by the end of it, not even one of my people was left. As my form changed, so did my desires and needs. I left to live in the wilderness amongst the beasts and other ancient ones. I have seen civilizations rise and fall. I have watched the earth change form almost as drastically as my own flesh. Most of the other ancients have fallen, and humanity has grown comfortable in the lands they once knew did not welcome them. He eyed us carefully and leaned forward, brushing the salt and ash away with his hand. You believe in so many things to protect you, but truly, children, what can plants and minerals do against power? We all froze. The imaginary safety of our boundary line was gone. Silence fell on our group. He smiled and tapped my sketchbook with one finger. Before I allow you to go, I would very much like to keep your book of ancients, child. Without thinking, I shook my head no, and he sighed. As I expected, alas, your hands will fall to the earth one day, and I will wait until then to claim it from you. In the meantime, I expect you to fill the empty pages for me. He stood and stepped back, then pointed to Theo's axe. You had the right idea, you know. Though only severing my head and piercing my heart with the ash could have saved you, and I doubt you could have managed that before I could overtake you. Theo spoke up. Why didn't you kill us too? The creature grinned. It amused me not to, and besides, sage in the blood tastes terrible. And with that, he was gone. It was still dark, and even though we knew the boundaries we'd drawn were meaningless, we stayed huddled around the fire until well after sunrise. Well, that was pretty much it. I hope you liked the story till then. Bye-bye.